Think about the last time you went to an airport. You probably arrived 2 hours early. You waited in a long, winding line. You took off your shoes, removed your belt, and pulled the laptop out of your bag. You threw away a perfectly good bottle of water because the liquid limit is exactly 3.4 ounces. Then, you stepped into a full-body scanner while a TSA agent inspected your driver's license to prove you are exactly who you say you are. It feels so normal today, so embedded in the fabric of modern travel, that we treat it like a law of nature. But here is something that might genuinely surprise you. If you were flying before 1973, absolutely none of that existed, and I mean none of it. Imagine walking into an American airport in 1968. You park your car, you stroll through the front doors of the terminal. You do not show a physical ID to anyone. You do not empty your pockets. You do not walk through a metal detector, because they weren't there. Your luggage is not x-rayed, searched, or even weighed with any real suspicion. If your family wanted to see you off, they didn't have to wait at the curb. They could walk right down the concourse, stand directly at the gate, and wave to you through the window as you boarded the plane. And if you happened to be carrying a loaded .38 caliber revolver in your coat pocket or a stick of dynamite in your briefcase, you could just walk right onto a commercial airliner, take your seat, and order a drink. Nobody knew, and honestly, nobody checked. For the first 5 decades of commercial aviation, security in the United States was based entirely on the honor system. It was an era of absolute, unfiltered freedom. So, the question isn't just academic, it's actually kind of terrifying. How did the most powerful nation on Earth allow millions of people to fly in metal tubes at 600 miles per hour with zero security? And what exactly happened in the late 1960s and early 1970s that forced the federal government to completely dismantle that freedom and rewire the way we travel forever? The answer takes us into a wild, forgotten chapter of American history, a time when hijacking a plane was so common it was practically a national pastime. Between 1968 and 1972, the American aviation industry experienced something so bizarre and so dangerously absurd that it sounds completely made up today. Historians now call it the golden age of hijacking, but back then, the media coined a brand new term for it, skyjacking. To understand how crazy things actually got, you just have to look at the numbers. Over a stretch of 5 years, there were more than 130 hijackings in United States airspace. Let that sink in for a second. At its absolute peak, a commercial American flight was being hijacked roughly once every 5 or 6 days. It was not a rare, shocking tragedy. It was a routine weekly occurrence. You could open your Tuesday morning newspaper and read about a stolen Boeing 727 right next to the local weather forecast. But who were these people taking over the planes? Today, we automatically associate the word hijacking with highly organized international terrorism. But in the late 1960s, the profile of a hijacker was completely different, and frankly, far more chaotic. Some of them were political radicals trying to make a bold statement. Some were fleeing bank robbers desperate to escape the FBI. Others were just deeply troubled individuals going through a personal crisis, thinking a stolen plane was the ultimate way to get the world's attention. There were even documented cases of people hijacking flights simply because they were homesick, financially ruined, or going through a messy divorce. Because there were no metal detectors and no bag searches at the gate, anyone with a grievance and a few dollars for a ticket could walk right onto a flight. Once the aircraft reached cruising altitude, they would calmly call over a flight attendant, open their jacket to reveal a pistol or a fake homemade explosive, and hand over a handwritten note for the captain. And here is the detail that is almost impossible to comprehend today. When a pilot received that threatening note, the reaction was not sheer panic. It was not a desperate fight for survival. It was usually just a heavy sigh of frustration. For the major airlines, a hijacking was not treated as a deadly crisis. It was treated as a customer service inconvenience. They had a strict policy of absolute compliance. Pilots were explicitly trained not to fight back, not to argue, and never to play the hero. They just followed new orders. So, where were all these stolen airplanes actually going? If you looked at a map of hijacked flights from that era, almost all the lines pointed to exactly one place, Havana, Cuba. Following the 1959 Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro's communist government completely froze diplomatic relations with the United States. There were absolutely no direct flights between the two countries. For American fugitives, political radicals, and desperate outcasts, Cuba became this mythical safe haven. They genuinely believed that if they forced an American plane to land in Havana, Castro would welcome them with open arms as revolutionary heroes. The reality was usually a lot less glamorous. Castro did not want a bunch of unpredictable American criminals roaming his streets. Most hijackers who landed in Cuba were immediately arrested by the military, thrown into tiny interrogation cells, and put to work cutting sugarcane in grueling labor camps. But back in the United States, the airlines adapted to this Havana craze in a way that is just mind-blowing. Instead of trying to stop the hijackings at the airport door, they literally prepared for them in the sky. Airlines began issuing what they formally called hijack packages to their pilots. If you were flying a commercial route anywhere near Florida in 1969, your cockpit was mandated to be equipped with approach charts for José Martí International Airport in Havana. The airlines even provided pilots with specialized Spanish translation guides so they could easily communicate with Cuban air traffic control. It became such a routine event that some pilots joked they should just start their announcements by saying, "Welcome aboard. Our final destination is Miami, unless the gentleman in row 4 decides we are going to Cuba." For the everyday passengers, being hijacked to Cuba became a bizarre cultural phenomenon. It was treated almost like a twisted, unexpected vacation detour. People would land in Havana, buy some authentic Cuban cigars, drink some local rum in the airport terminal, and simply wait for the airline to wire a landing fee to the Cuban government. Once the cash cleared, the plane would just fly back to Florida. It was an enormous financial and logistical headache, but the crucial point was this: nobody was dying. The passengers were safe, the planes were returned, and the system kept moving. And that is exactly why the multi-million-dollar airline industry aggressively refused to change the rules. You might be wondering, if commercial planes were getting hijacked every single week, why didn't the federal government just step in and mandate airport security right away? The answer is incredibly simple, and it is deeply rooted in American capitalism: corporate profit. In the 1960s, flying was still marketed as a premium, highly glamorous experience. The airline executives believed that their entire multi-billion-dollar business model relied on absolute convenience and speed. The mere idea of stopping a wealthy businessman in a tailored suit, making him open his briefcase, and searching through his private, personal belongings was considered highly offensive. The airline industry actively and aggressively lobbied against the Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA, and any local politicians who even suggested mandatory security checkpoints. The corporate bosses argued that physical bag searches and electronic metal detectors would do something much worse than a hijacking. It would fundamentally scare the American public. They firmly believed that if everyday passengers felt like they were entering a high-security prison or a militarized zone just to catch a flight, they would simply stop buying tickets. People would just choose to drive their cars or take the train instead. Ultimately, it came down to a very cold, highly calculated financial equation. The airline executives looked directly at the spreadsheets. A hijacked flight to Havana cost a company roughly $20,000 to $30,000 in extra fuel, international landing fees, and passenger accommodations. But hiring tens of thousands of security guards, purchasing expensive new electronic equipment for every terminal, and delaying hundreds of daily flights across the entire country, that would cost millions upon millions of dollars every single year. It was literally cheaper for the airlines to just let the planes get hijacked. Even when the government finally tried to push back, their efforts were incredibly weak. In 1969, the FAA introduced a psychological behavioral profiling system and rolled out a few primitive metal detectors, but they made the program completely voluntary for the airlines to use. Unsurprisingly, the major airlines just ignored the program. They flat out refused to slow down their boarding lines. The airlines were playing a very dangerous game of Russian roulette with human lives. They operated under the strict, naive assumption that hijackers only wanted a free ride to Cuba or a quick, dramatic moment on the evening news. They assumed the passengers would always remain perfectly safe as long as the pilots cooperated and the airlines paid the bills. But that arrogant corporate gamble was about to backfire in the most terrifying way imaginable. The rules of the skyjacking game were about to change rapidly, and the ultimate stakes were no longer just a brief, sunny tropical detour. The era of the quirky, almost polite Cuban detours ended abruptly in the early 1970s. Criminals watching the evening news suddenly realized a massive loophole in the system. An airplane was not just a vehicle, it was the ultimate bargaining chip. You could use it to extort enormous amounts of cash from the government and the corporations. And nobody proved this dangerous theory more effectively than a ghost of a man we now know as D.B. Cooper. On the afternoon of November 24, 1971, a man wearing a sharp business suit and dark sunglasses walked into the Portland International Airport. Because there were zero security checks, he paid cash for a one-way ticket under the fake name Dan Cooper, casually carried a heavy briefcase onto Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305, and ordered a bourbon and soda. Shortly after takeoff, he handed a calm, neatly folded note to a flight attendant. She ignored it at first, assuming he was just giving her his phone number, but he leaned in and whispered, "Miss, you better look at that note. I have a bomb." He popped open his briefcase to reveal a terrifying arrangement of red cylinders and wires. His demand was simple but unprecedented. He wanted $200,000 in untraceable cash, worth well over $1 million today, and 4 parachutes. True to their strict policy of absolute compliance, the airline executives paid the ransom without hesitation. The plane landed, Cooper collected the heavy bags of cash, released the passengers, and ordered the pilots to take off again toward Mexico. But somewhere over the freezing, pitch-black forests of Washington state, he did the unthinkable. He strapped on a parachute, lowered the aircraft's rear staircase mid-flight, and jumped out into the freezing night. He vanished into thin air, completely escaping the FBI, and became an instant American legend. But for the aviation industry, D.B. Cooper was an absolute nightmare. His flawless heist acted as a global television advertisement for violent extortion. Suddenly, hijackings were no longer about getting a free flight to Havana. They were about scoring massive paydays. In the year following Cooper's jump, there were dozens of violent copycat attempts. The skies were rapidly filling with heavily armed criminals demanding millions, and the airline's strategy of simply handing over the money was collapsing. The situation was spiraling completely out of control, and it was about to get much worse. D.B. Cooper was often romanticized as a gentleman thief, but the wave of copycats he inspired were violent, desperate, and completely unpredictable. By late 1972, the situation in the skies had escalated from simple financial extortion to pure, unhinged terrorism. The ultimate tipping point, the specific, horrifying event that finally broke the airline industry's stubborn resistance, happened on November 10, 1972. Southern Airways Flight 49 took off from Birmingham, Alabama, heading for Memphis. Shortly after takeoff, 3 men, heavily armed with .38 caliber handguns and live hand grenades, violently stormed the cockpit and took control of the aircraft. Unlike Cooper, these men were highly erratic, visibly angry, and incredibly dangerous. They didn't just want a few $100,000, they demanded an absolutely impossible ransom of $10 million in cold, hard cash. What followed was one of the most harrowing events in aviation history. Over the next 30 agonizing hours, the hijackers forced the terrified pilots to fly a chaotic route across multiple cities, eventually touching down in Canada and Cuba. The pilots were exhausted, flying practically blind. The FBI, desperate to end the exhausting standoff, made a highly controversial move. While the plane was briefly on the tarmac in Florida, federal agents shot out the aircraft's tires. But this aggressive, risky move backfired completely. It only enraged the hijackers further. Furious and feeling totally cornered, the desperate hijackers forced the pilot to take off again, even with shredded, smoking tires. And this is the exact moment they made a threat that chilled the United States government to its absolute core. They ordered the pilot to turn the plane around and fly directly toward the Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee, a massive, highly sensitive federal nuclear research facility. They got on the radio and explicitly threatened to nosedive the fully fueled commercial airliner directly into the nuclear reactor if their $10 million demand was not met. Let that sink in for a second. Decades before the unthinkable horrors of September 11th, the American government was suddenly forced to wake up to a terrifying new reality. A commercial passenger plane was no longer just a mode of transportation, and it was no longer just a flying hostage cell. It could be weaponized into a literal weapon of mass destruction. A targeted crash at the Oak Ridge facility would have caused an unprecedented, catastrophic radiological disaster on American soil. The entire federal government was completely paralyzed by the threat. Ultimately, after intense negotiations, the crippled plane managed to land safely in Cuba, where Fidel Castro's military immediately arrested the hijackers after a brief, tense shootout. The exhausted passengers and crew miraculously survived the ordeal. But the naive illusion of safety in American skies had been permanently shattered. The government finally realized they could never, ever let this happen again. The terrifying reality of Flight 49 finally broke the political deadlock in Washington. The federal government could no longer trust the airline executives to police themselves. The old corporate argument that security checks would hurt ticket sales was completely thrown out the window. The stakes were simply too high. President Richard Nixon and the Federal Aviation Administration realized that if they didn't act immediately, a major American city could face a catastrophic disaster. On December 5, 1972, the FAA issued a sweeping, unprecedented emergency mandate, ordering that new, strict rules would go into effect exactly 1 month later. On January 5, 1973, the absolute freedom of the American sky vanished overnight. The transformation was sudden, chaotic, and completely massive. In a matter of weeks, the entire physical layout of airports across the country was aggressively rewired. For the very first time in history, a strict, hard boundary was drawn between the public lobby and the boarding gates. You could no longer just casually walk your family down to the tarmac to say goodbye. Every single passenger, without exception, was now legally required to pass through an electronic metal detector, known back then as a magnetometer. If a passenger set off the alarm, they were subjected to a highly intrusive physical pat-down. Every single piece of carry-on luggage was either opened and manually inspected by a newly hired security guard or passed through a brand new bulky X-ray machine. The public reaction was a mixture of deep confusion and intense frustration. Americans were fiercely protective of their privacy, and many felt deeply insulted by the implication that they were all being treated like potential criminals. Businessmen were outraged that their briefcases were being opened and searched in public. Civil rights groups aggressively filed lawsuits, arguing that these blanket, universal searches were a direct violation of the Fourth Amendment, which protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. But the federal courts ultimately ruled that the overarching safety of the public outweighed individual privacy at the airport door. And the most shocking part of this massive overnight transformation? It actually worked. Almost immediately, the skyjacking epidemic flatlined. In 1972, there were nearly 30 hijacking attempts in the United States. In 1973, under the new strict security rules, that number dropped to virtually zero. The wild, lawless frontier of commercial aviation was officially closed forever. The infrastructure of modern travel had been permanently born out of sheer panic. The events of 1973 didn't just stop hijackers, they permanently altered the psychological relationship between the American citizen and the state. Before that January mandate, the government trusted you until you gave them a reason not to. You were an innocent traveler. But after 1973, the baseline assumption flipped. To step onto an airplane, you were no longer assumed innocent. You were a potential threat who had to actively prove your innocence by submitting to a search. This was a massive, fundamental shift in American culture, and it was just the beginning. The security apparatus born in the 1970s laid the exact groundwork for the world we live in today. When the tragic events of September 11, 2001 shattered the nation, the government didn't have to invent a new philosophy of airport security. They just dramatically amplified the one created in 1973. The private security guards were replaced by the federal TSA. The simple metal detectors evolved into full-body microwave scanners. The physical bag checks turned into liquid bans, shoe removals, and highly aggressive pat-downs. Today, we accept all of this without a second thought. We stand in long lines, we empty our pockets, and we surrender our privacy because we have made a collective, unspoken agreement. We willingly traded our absolute freedom for the comforting promise of total security. And the hardest truth to swallow is that the system works. Planes are incredibly safe today. But it forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. When we allowed the government to build that first hard boundary between the public and the boarding gate, did we cross a line we can never walk back? We gained safety, but we completely lost the golden era of unfiltered, fearless travel. We accepted a world where safety requires suspicion. The next time you are standing barefoot in an airport security line, waiting for a stranger to scan your belongings, take a moment to look around. You are not just looking at a travel procedure. You are looking at the living legacy of D.B. Cooper, of desperate hijackers, and of a society that decided freedom is just too dangerous to leave unchecked. If this story changed the way you view the world around you, let me know in the comments below. Do you think we gave up too much freedom? Make sure to hit that subscribe button. We dive deep into the hidden history of the systems that shape our daily lives.